千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Daodejing by Lao Zi. As ever, I would like to extend a warm welcome to one and all. Thank you for joining us. I want to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. As I mentioned in the beginning of our talk today, the segue is good because chapter 74 and 75 are oftentimes seen as a connected unit. Indeed, the same is extended back to prior to 74 to 73. So you can think of 73, 74, and 75 as a connected whole, one big lesson expressed in three parts. So here is the Chinese title for chapter 75, 贵生章. The translation for that, you can see right below chapter 75, value life. This is where I need to stop everyone and sound a note of caution. When you just look at value life, it is very easy to misunderstand what that means. In the Western world, we look at an expression like value life and we think of that as a good thing. Yes, we should value all life. Life is precious, so we should not take life. We should value life, etc. That actually isn't what the two characters mean. Now, individually, we translate them. The character to the leftmost character is value, correct? The character in the middle is life, also correct. But let me explain the original context. It is actually not the positive context to value life in the perspective of being compassionate, like refrain from killing. That's not what it's referring to. In this chapter, as you will see when we discuss it in detail, it specifically means valuing one's own life so excessively from a selfish perspective, from an egocentric perspective, that leads to an excessive pursuit of material wealth, luxuries, physical enjoyments, fulfillment of physical desires, and attachments. So now, as you can see, far from a positive context, it's actually quite negative. This is the reason why it is important for us to have these gatherings to explain what the original meaning was. Sometimes the original meaning is intuitively obvious. Other times, like this one right here, it's actually opposed to what we would describe as intuition or common sense. So you will see how we can explain that in great detail. Let's go ahead and take a look at the chapter itself. Daodejing, chapter 75. The people's hunger is due to the excess of their rulers' taxation, so they starve. The people's difficulty in being governed is due to the meddling of their ruler, so they are difficult to govern. The people's disregard for death is due to the glut in their ruler's pursuit of life, so they disregard death. Therefore, those who do not strive for living are better than those who value living. Okay, that is the chapter. Couple of things I'll point out. If you look at the very end, those who value living, those last two characters are the chapter title. Those actually map to line 8 line 11 maps to line 8, which is about the glut in the ruler's pursuit of life. And that is the reason why I say value living is not a virtue. It's about this selfish pursuit of material treasures and also physical pleasures. And that is a negative thing. So let's go ahead and break it down, identify the different sections, and then I can explain the lines one by one. Looking at this chapter here, I think just by looking at the English portion of it, it is easy to see that the words the people is reiterated once every 3 lines. So in line 1, line 4, and also line 7, you see the peoples. And if you look back to the Chinese characters, you see that the same character is recurring as the first character of line 1, line 4, and line 7. So let me go ahead and highlight the repetition there. I'm going to label this repetition A so you can see. And I'm highlighting both the Chinese reiterations as well as English so you can see how the translation matches the original. So what about line 2, line 5, and line 8? Can everyone see the repetition as well? You can see that the first 3 characters, the Chinese characters, first 3 characters of line 2 are the same as the first 3 characters of line 5, and they're also the same as the first 3 characters of line 8. And if you take a look at the English, you can see that the first few words are the same. So we can go ahead and highlight those, and I'm going to call them repetition B. And then if you take a look at line 3, line 6, and line 9, you're going to see that they have the beginning characters in common as well. And then when you look at the English, you see the same words. They start with the same words. So let me highlight those. And I'm going to call those repetition C. Now you can see that in the beginning of this chapter, all the way to near the end, we've got ABC, ABC, ABC. That's the poetic repetition for this particular chapter. And I think that makes it clear. And you can also see that line 10 and line 11 are the concluding lines. One more thing that I'll point out before we go to the line by line detailed explanation. The ABC repetitions for the first 9 lines are about the people, the subjects, and their ruler. Okay, so it's about the ancient kingdoms, the king or the ancient empire, the emperor, ruling the subjects, the citizens of the empire, the subjects of the kingdom. That's what it seems to be about. The last 2 lines, though, no longer contain references to the ruler. And it's a general statement about how those who do not strive for living are better than those who value living. Remember, value living means a selfish pursuit of materialistic pleasures. So those who do not strive for living, those are the ones that live in accordance with the Tao. And those 2 lines I need to point out are the lines that apply to everybody, not just the king and the king's subjects, nor the emperor and the citizens of the empire. What I'm trying to say is that this entire chapter, the first 9 lines appear to be talking about ruling a kingdom or ruling an empire. But in fact, you can see from the last 2 lines that even the first 9 lines from 1 to 9 are applicable to all of us. And you have previously already learned that when we talk about the kings and emperors, we're really talking about you as a sovereign entity in your own life. You make the decisions, you take charge of your destiny, and therefore all of these lines are applicable. Okay, with that in mind, we can do the line-by-line analysis. Let's start with the first line. The first line says, the people's hunger. And when we talk about the people's hunger, this is speaking to widespread starvation in ancient times at the surface level. It appears to be talking about widespread starvation like famine in ancient times. Now, there are multiple possible causes for that. For instance, if we talk about the natural causes for widespread starvation, we can be talking about natural disasters, drought, flooding, locusts. And in the time of ancient China, flooding was specifically a big issue, a big problem. And this is because in the ancient land, ancient China being agrarian society, there was a lot of farming being done, and the best soil or the fertile soil along the banks of a great river, like the Yellow River. And so farmlands would be cultivated along the river. Unfortunately, in ancient times, there was a lack of modern technology to create a huge dam to regulate the flow, and therefore, during certain times of the year, flooding will likely occur. So even in ancient times, they have figured out ways to try to mitigate that situation. Now, they weren't always successful, and that is why flooding still occurred from time to time. Whenever it occurred, it would destroy the farms, it would cause people to have to start over, and while they are suffering the aftermath of that disaster, people would starve. So natural causes were definitely part of the equation in ancient times. And that's not all. There's also man-made causes. What could that be? Well, one of them would be widespread warfare and chaos. And this is described multiple places in the Daodejing. The example that I want to bring to your attention is from Daodejing chapter 30. In lines 6 and 7 of that chapter, it says, following the great army, there must be an inauspicious year. And what that specifically says is that in the aftermath of a great battle, the clash of these humongous ancient armies, it leaves a lot of death and destruction behind. And therefore, in the aftermath of that battle, people will starve because the land, the farms, they've all been destroyed. So that's definitely a very bad thing, very disastrous thing for the people. Now, that is not the only possible man-made cause that results in massive widespread starvation. Man-made causes could also include things like tyranny or corruption in the ruling elite. So typically, tyrants back in ancient times, they would threaten people with death and strip them bare. That they don't have any resources to call their own, the ruling elites could take whatever they wanted. This was the subtext of the previous chapter that we had studied, and it said, remember, it began with people do not fear death. How can they be threatened with death? The subtext is the tyranny that was using fear to rule the land and then taking the resources from the people so that the people starved. Then Lao Zi follows that up with line 2. Line 2 says, is due to the excess of the ruler's taxation. So Lao Tzu knew that there could be natural disasters as well, but he was definitely putting the focus on ruling, on the bad rulers. So what I want to do, first of all, is to break down this line. This line has 7 characters. Let me show you what they mean. The first character is because. And then the second character is possessive. So depending on whether it's singular or plural, it could be there. It could also be its, its. Then the third character is the character for up or high. Typically, that's the meaning of the character. In this context, that character means ruler. And that is because it's used in place of naming the ruler. It's just saying that the person who is high up, who is above the people, ruling the people. So it's actually, the meaning is actually ruler and not high or up. Then the fourth character simply means eat. Not a whole lot of alternative translations for that. And then the next character there, the third from last, is tax. And then there's a character for apostrophe s, and then the last character is excess. So when you string that together, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense as an English sentence, but the meaning is, as you see in the translation for line 2, is due to the excess of the ruler's taxation. So the bottom line is that among all the causes of starvation for the people, Lao Tzu is pointing out the excessive taxation more so than the natural causes. He's saying that the bad rulers, the people who are tyrants, who rule poorly, those are the causes more so than poor harvests. And if the ruler had wisdom, the wise ruler would prepare for natural disasters before they occurred. The tyrants would do no such thing, which would cause the natural disasters to be even worse. The unwise ruler would oppress the people no matter what, in good times or bad, when there are disasters and when there is a good harvest. The unwise ruler, the tyrants, would be oppressive regardless. So the last line of this section is, so they starve. So the people starve. For the kingdom, immense starvation of the subjects, the misery, the suffering of the people. And we don't want to take this line lightly because in ancient times, starvation was often a matter of life and death. So this is prior to civilization developed to a point where there's advanced communication and transportation so that disaster relief could be brought to the regions that suffer disasters. When there is a disaster that struck, oftentimes there was no good way, no good method, no survival mechanism for the people who were afflicted, and therefore oftentimes a matter of life and death. This is true not just in ancient China, but in the ancient world as a whole. It's the entire world throughout history. So one of the things that modern technology, modern civilization has brought to the benefits of mankind is to be able to handle natural disasters better than before. Not perfect, just improved. Of course, as I mentioned, the worst of the worst would be tyranny combined with natural disasters. There were no shortage of that in ancient times as well. This is the reason why previously I shared a story with everyone about tyranny. And this was a story from the life of Confucius. During the time of the Warring States, Confucius traveled widely among all the kingdoms. During the Warring States, his goal was to talk to the rulers and to guide them, hopefully nudge them toward a path that was not quite so tyrannical. And during his travels, he came across this woman who was crying before a gravesite. And upon asking, what she was crying about, the old woman related that her father, her husband, her son all died by wild tiger, man-eating carnivorous tiger in that region that was preying on human beings. And her loved ones were all gone because of that. So of course, Confucius is like, why don't you guys just move away? Why do you have to live here? And the answer that surprised him was that the woman said, well, we have wild tigers here that eat humans, but we do not have tyranny. We are free from tyranny. So this made the point to Confucius and his disciples that people actually were much more afraid of tyranny than even they were of the fearsome tiger. So this drove the point home that how bad things could be in ancient times, living under tyranny. Now, I mentioned when we talked about the overall chapter that at the very end of this chapter, we would see the 2 lines from Lao Tzu, which gives us a hint that these passages are not aimed at the king or the emperor, but aimed at everybody, you and me. So what we want to do is to map this ancient wisdom to our modern lives to see where we can make the pieces fit. So hunger in ancient times among the people, if you were to bring that into a modern context, to apply that to the individual, meaning you or me, and then to put that into a spiritual context, then what you get is that hunger in this case refers to the need of spiritual sustenance. Because we human beings do not live by bread alone. The spirit, the human spirit, also requires nourishment. We don't just have to look after the belly, we also have to look after the mind and the soul. So that is the point. So I also refer to the idea that whenever the Daodejing is addressing the king or the emperor, the ruler, we can easily see that it's actually addressing us. It's actually talking about you and me, because we are the rulers of our lives, and that means we can rule with or without wisdom. We can be the wise ruler, or we can be unwise, we can be the tyrant. And what happens when we ruled wisely? What happens when we ruled unwisely? To be unwise, in this case, the metaphor being used is excessive taxation. What would that mean for us? Well, taxation, in our case, living our lives, can mean that we overtax ourselves with the pursuit of material things or physical pleasures. When that happens, there's going to be hunger, there's going to be spiritual hunger, and even spiritual starvation. The spirit can be starved if we overtax ourselves with material pursuits. So that is the meaning. That is how we can map that first section into modern life. Let me lay it out in parallel lines so everyone can see how they come together. So at the surface level, we can see Lao Tzu was describing the situation in ancient times when the hunger of the people was due to the excessive taxation of a corrupt and tyrannical government. And that's why they starved. Now, what we want to do is to bring that into our lives. Of course, we're not We're not literally kings or emperors, but we are the rulers of our own lives. So the hunger there maps to a spiritual hunger and yearning for something more than what we have in the material world. Surely there is more than what we can see and what we can grasp. Now, if we were to overly, excessively tax ourselves with materialistic pursuits, physical pleasures, then we end up starving the spirit, so we have that gnawing feeling of emptiness, a feeling that never quite goes away. And we can temporarily forget that feeling by using the material world, seeking thrills, perhaps lose our sense in pursuing substance abuse, perhaps lose ourselves in entertainment by watching some sort of entertainment, movies, television, temporarily forget that feeling of emptiness, but sooner or later, that emptiness comes back. That hunger doesn't go away until you actually feed the spirit. So that's the important point. So the first section has relevance in ancient times as well as modern lives, your life and mine. So I think we are now ready for the second section. Line 4 says, the people's difficulty in being governed. And this is something that we have seen before. Basically, the oppressed people will inevitably become increasingly difficult to govern. That is, as you can imagine, the oppressed people become ever more resistant and disobedient. They may appear to be obedient at the surface level, but when the backs of the corrupt officials are turned, the people will go back to doing what they need to do to survive. Now, in seeing the resistance and the disobedience, the tyrants will react, and typically the tyrants will impose even more rules, even more harsh punishment, and enforce those rules by punishing people. Unfortunately, that leads to a negative result, more opposition, more evasion, and everything goes downhill from there. So that is a historical pattern that we have seen many times. Line 5 says, is due to the meddling of their ruler. I want to highlight a couple of characters there and make sure that we understand exactly what they're saying. The last two characters of this line, 有为, here's the pinyin. It's easy to look at that and say, oh, you wei? No, it's 有为. And this is the opposite of wu wei. If you study the Tao, it is likely that you have already come across wu wei, the principle of non-attachment. Sometimes there's a misnomer that says wu wei is the principle of non-action. It's actually not non-action. Sometimes non-attachment leads to non-action. Sometimes non-attachment leads to minimal action. That's wu wei. So wu wei is still on the side of the action-oriented. However, 有为 just means you have attachments. You have, in fact, excessive attachments, too much attachments. And what that means is that out of the excessive attachments, one will oftentimes act to interfere or to meddle in other people's business that have nothing to do with you. So the 有为, 有 in this case is to have. Wu wei, the wu in that case is to not have. And the wei character is the one that is best translated in this case to attachment. So let's continue on. You can see that this is all about the ruler meddling with people's lives. So let's take a look at the whole line. It's due to the meddling of their ruler. And that's the very definition of tyranny. It's interfering with, meddling with the lives of the oppressed people. It's not just the tyrant. Usually in a tyrannical government, corruption is rife. So corrupt officials at every level of the government, they themselves interfere with people's means of livelihood. So what that specifically means is that the tyrants will impose a heavy tax, but then every level of government, because of corruption, will extract its own take. So less will get to the tyrants. The tyrant will then increase the tax even more, allowing the corrupt officials to take even more for themselves. Then there's also the excessive, burdensome rules that complicate daily activities. There are draconian laws and harsh punishment that make people afraid. And remember, we were just talking about using fear as a way to keep the population under control. So this is definitely associated with that. So this section, there's a lot more to talk about. I see that we're getting close to the top of the hour, so we'll need to stop at our discussion today at this point and pick it up again in this slide in our next meeting. For now, it is important for us to summarize what we have talked about so far. We've done 2 main points out of 3. Let's cover them. Number 1 is the mapping to modern world about spiritual sustenance. This is the part about the people starving, either due to natural causes or man-made disasters like warfare or tyrannical rule. In our world, we can see that as rulers of our lives, we can also starve the spirit. And therefore, the teaching from Lao Tzu, the essence is that we have to keep the spirit well fed. So spiritual sustenance, I would describe that as spiritual food for thoughts. So just because we're all gathering together talking about this, I think this is exactly what we're doing, and I hope that you would agree with me. Number 2, this is the parts about governance, the difficulty in governance that maps to managing relationships. We will talk more about this later on. For now, this is a preview. And having studied the Tao all these years, we know that when we interfere excessively with other people, that's going to cause people to be alienated. It's going to push them away. Whereas the Tao approach is one that will strengthen the connection. So rather than to interfere excessively, the idea is to use the soft touch, the Tao approach. We'll talk more about that in the next meeting. The next one is also associated, is also something that we'll cover in the next meeting. It's about living the best life. We just got done talking about living well is the best revenge, and therefore we should also talk about what exactly that means. It is definitely not about the glut of luxuries. It's about the lasting joy and happiness. So we'll discuss exactly how we get to there from here. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.